Rachel sat nervously on the edge of the cold, sterile examination table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The small clinic was cramped and dimly lit, the only sounds the faint hum of the overhead lights and the muffled traffic from outside. She had always imagined sharing this moment with Chandler, filled with joy and anticipation. Instead, she was alone, waiting for the test results that would confirm her growing suspicion. She was pregnant. The door creaked open, and a sympathetic nurse entered, her face etched with a soft smile that did little to ease Rachel's anxiety. "Rachel, congratulations," the nurse said, handing her the positive pregnancy test. "You're going to be a mother." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The words she had longed to hear now echoed in her head like a distant, haunting melody. She should have felt elated, but the joy was overshadowed by a gnawing fear of how Chandler would react. He had been distant lately, his once warm glances now cold and calculating. "Thank you," Rachel murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if bracing against a chill only she could feel. As she left the clinic, the city around her seemed to blur into a cascade of unrecognizable colors and sounds. She needed to tell Chandler. He had the right to know, and deep down, she still hoped for his support. Later that day, they met at a small park, their usual spot, where the first flowers of spring were beginning to bloom. Chandler sat on the bench, his eyes fixed on his phone. Rachel approached, her steps hesitant. "Chandler, we need to talk," she began, her voice trembling with a cocktail of emotions. Chandler looked up, his smile not reaching his eyes. "What's up, Rachel?" he asked, his tone indifferent. Taking a deep breath, Rachel held his gaze, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "I'm pregnant, Chandler." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. For a moment, Chandler just stared at her, his face unreadable. Then his expression hardened, the lines around his mouth turning into a scowl. "Pregnant? How could you be so careless, Rachel?" Rachel recoiled as if slapped. "Careless?" The accusation stung, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I thought you'd be happy," she stammered, her heart sinking. Chandler stood up abruptly, his anger palpable. "Happy? Rachel? Do you even realize the position this puts me in?" His voice was harsh, cutting through the gentle rustle of the leaves above them. As Rachel struggled to comprehend his reaction, Chandler's next words shattered any illusions of a happy future together. "Look, I'm engaged to someone else. This was never meant to be permanent. You need to fix this, Rachel." The world seemed to spin around her, the park, the bench, Chandler's face, all blurring into a vortex of betrayal. "Engaged to someone else?" Her voice cracked, each word soaked with disbelief and pain. "Yes, and I can't have this scandal ruin everything. I'll give you some money. Take care of it," Chandler said coldly, pulling out his wallet and throwing some bills at her feet. Rachel felt a profound emptiness as she watched the money flutter to the ground, each bill a testament to the cruel reality of her situation. "How can you be so cruel?" she whispered, tears now streaming down her face. Chandler turned to leave, his steps quick and resolute. "It's for the best. You'll see. This is not my problem, Rachel." As he disappeared into the distance, Rachel sank to her knees, the fallen bills around her a grim mosaic of rejection and despair. She sobbed quietly, the sound muffled by the chirping of the birds and the rustling of the leaves, a stark contrast to the storm raging in her heart. The nurse's gentle words at the clinic echoed mockingly in her mind. "Congratulations," echoed around the stark, empty walls of her heart, a heart now filled with a sorrow too deep to articulate. This was not the joyous revelation she had envisioned, but a harsh descent into a reality where she was utterly alone. Rachel gathered the money, each bill feeling heavier than the last, and stood up slowly. The park, once a place of shared laughter and whispered dreams with Chandler, now felt cold and alien. As she walked home, the chill of the evening air seemed to seep into her bones, a cruel reminder of the loneliness that awaited her. As Rachel walked home from the park, the cold reality of Chandler's betrayal still stinging, she found herself reflecting on the past. It was as if the harsh words and the dismissal had unearthed memories long buried, memories of a childhood marred by shadows and turmoil. Her childhood home, a modest trailer in a park filled with similar homes, had always been a place of stark contrasts. The laughter and warmth provided by her mother, Emma, stood in sharp opposition to the darker, more destructive forces brought on by her father, Carlos. Rachel could still remember the sound of her mother's soft humming as she cooked, a soothing counterpoint to the often harsh discord of Carlos's drunken outbursts. One evening when Rachel was about 10 years old stood out in her memory, a defining moment that had sown the seeds of her desire to escape the life she had known. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the cramped living room where she was attempting to focus on her homework. The sound of the television was a dull murmur in the background, almost drowned out by the sound of her father fumbling with his keys at the door. "Carlos, please be quiet. Rachel is studying." Emma's voice was gentle yet firm, a vain attempt to ward off the impending storm. Carlos stumbled in, the smell of alcohol enveloping him like a toxic cloud. His face was flushed, his eyes glazed, and as he dropped his keys on the table, they clattered loudly, echoing through the small space. Rachel flinched, her concentration broken. "I'm being quiet, I'm just—" Carlos slurred his words, his loud voice filled with an edge of aggression. "I'm just living in my own house." Emma sighed, moving towards him with a weary expression. "Let's get you to bed. You need to rest," she said, trying to guide him gently by the arm. Carlos jerked his arm away, his anger flaring suddenly. "Don't tell me what I need," he shouted, his voice booming in the confined trailer. He swung his arm, knocking a lamp off the nearby table. It crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. Rachel, startled by the sudden violence, dropped her books and scrambled to a corner. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Emma, with a calmness born of too many similar nights, moved quickly to Rachel's side. She knelt beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her trembling shoulders. "It's okay, Rachel. It's going to be okay," she whispered, her voice a mixture of reassurance and sadness. But Rachel, young as she was, could see the strain in her mother's eyes, the slight tremor in her voice. It was in that moment, amidst the broken glass and the sharp, acrid smell of alcohol, that Rachel realized she wanted more than this life of unpredictable storms. She wanted peace, stability, a world away from the chaos that her father brought into their lives. The memory faded as Rachel reached her small apartment, the one she had managed to afford with her job at the local diner. It wasn't much, but it was hers. A sanctuary from the world and, up until today, a shared dream of a future with Chandler. As she unlocked her door, the loneliness of the apartment seemed to echo her own hollow feelings. Inside, the quiet was a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions swirling within her. She leaned back against the door, letting out a long, slow breath. "I will make it through this," she murmured to herself, the resolve in her voice steeling her for the future. The determination that had first sparked in that troubled childhood home was still alive in her, burning more fiercely now than ever. Rachel knew that no matter the darkness of the past, she had the power to chase the light. And for her unborn child, she would chase it to the ends of the earth, just as her mother had done for her. Rachel often found herself wandering back to the day she first met Chandler. It had seemed like a moment of fate, a break from the unrelenting grey of her daily struggles. She was a teenager then, filled with the quiet desperation of someone who had seen too much too soon. And the encounter had sparkled with the promise of something new, something different. It was late afternoon in the bustling heart of the city, a place where Rachel rarely ventured alone. The streets thrummed with the energy of the crowd, and Rachel, with her guard perpetually up, tried to blend into the background. Her attempt to go unnoticed failed when a boisterous man blocked her path, his intentions clear in his leering smile. "Hey, pretty, why don't you give me your number?" he asked, stepping uncomfortably close. Rachel's heart raced. She could smell the coffee on his breath as she backed away. "No, please leave me alone," she said, her voice a mixture of fear and defiance. Just as the man moved closer, his hand reaching out to grab her arm, a voice cut through the tension. "Hey, is there a problem here?" Chandler stepped forward, his presence commanding. Tall and confident, he looked at the man with a steely gaze that Rachel would come to associate with a hero's arrival. The man, momentarily startled, scowled at Chandler, but then shrugged dismissively and walked away, muttering under his breath. "Are you okay?" Chandler asked, turning to Rachel with a concerned look that melted her initial fear. "Yes, thank you," Rachel replied, her breath catching as their eyes met. There was something about him, a warmth that seemed to pull her towards him. "I'm Chandler," he introduced himself, his smile easy and disarming. "Rachel," she responded, feeling a strange sense of safety in his presence. From that day, their friendship blossomed quickly into romance. Chandler was everything Rachel had dreamed of, attentive, charming, and seemingly open-hearted. He brought her small gifts, took her out on thoughtful dates, and always seemed to say the right thing at the right time. Rachel, in her inexperience, was swept off her feet. But as their relationship deepened, Chandler began to weave a subtle web that slowly isolated her from her friends. It was always framed as concern for her well-being, for the company she kept. Rachel, grateful for his attention and care, didn't see the signs. "They don't really understand you like I do," Chandler would say, and Rachel, enamored and naive, believed him. One evening, as they walked under the city lights, Chandler spoke of a future together. "Imagine us, Rachel, building a life where no one can tell us what to do or who to be," he whispered, his voice laden with promise. Rachel, her heart full of hope, had nodded, her dreams aligning with his words. But the warmth of that night soon cooled. Chandler became distant, his calls less frequent, his excuses flimsy. Rachel's confusion grew with each passing day, the stark contrast to his previous attentiveness casting a deep, unsettling shadow over her heart. Years later, the bitter truth would unravel in the most unexpected way. Rachel, now wiser and more cautious, spotted Chandler in town. He was laughing, his arm around the shoulders of the very man who had harassed her that first day. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The harassment had been a setup, a play designed to make Chandler her hero. The revelation shattered the last remnants of her illusions about Chandler. She understood then that his manipulation had not just been a betrayal of her trust, it had been a calculated move to draw her in. The initial warmth and safety she had felt in his presence were nothing more than an illusion, a mirage in the desert of her loneliness. As Rachel sat alone in her apartment, the memories of that day playing over in her mind, She felt a deep, searing anger at the deception. But beneath that anger was a budding determination, a resolve to never let herself be so blinded again. Her past, with all its shadows and illusions, would not define her future. The sun was rising, casting a soft glow over the city as Rachel walked toward the university campus. It was her first day as a medical student, a day she had scarcely dared to imagine during those dark moments filled with despair and betrayal. As she passed under the arching entrance of the university, a symbol of knowledge and future, a sense of accomplishment, washed over her. This was her new beginning, her chance to forge a path defined by her dreams, not her hardships. She found herself early for her first class, the campus mostly quiet except for the distant sounds of other early risers. Sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. Her journey here hadn't been easy. After discovering Chandler's betrayal, she had spiraled into a period of deep introspection. It had been her mother, Emma, who had gently nudged her toward the pursuit of education. "Turn your pain into something beautiful," Emma had said one evening, her voice both soft and firm. "Let your struggles teach you strength." Inspired by her mother's wisdom and fueled by the desire to provide a better life for her unborn child, Rachel had thrown herself into her studies. She had faced stigma as a single pregnant woman in her community college, whispers and sideways glances that had tested her resolve. But with each challenge, she had grown stronger, more resilient. She had graduated top of her class, earning not just her degree, but a scholarship to medical school. Her reverie was broken by the arrival of other students, their voices a blend of excitement and nervous energy. Rachel stood, taking a deep breath, and walked to her first class. The lecture hall was a cavernous room, filled with rows of seats, each one soon to be filled by an aspiring doctor. She chose a seat near the front, laying out her notebook and pen, a simple ritual that grounded her. As the professor entered, the room hushed. He was a middle-aged man with a kind face and a demeanor that suggested he was no stranger to inspiring young minds. "Welcome to the beginning of your journey in medicine," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "Here, you will learn to heal, to help, and to change lives. But most importantly, you will learn about yourselves, about your resilience and your ability to overcome obstacles." Rachel felt as though he was speaking directly to her. Her thoughts drifted to Chandler, to the painful lessons she had learned. She had come to understand that her relationship with him had been a distorted mirror, reflecting back a version of herself she no longer recognized. No longer a victim of circumstances, she was now the architect of her future. The lecture continued, a fascinating dive into human anatomy. Rachel absorbed every word, every detail with an eagerness that filled her with purpose. She was particularly struck by a discussion on the human heart, not just its physical workings, but its symbolic significance in culture and literature. "It's resilient, much like us," the professor noted. "It adapts, it recovers, and it continues to beat even under the most trying conditions." After class, Rachel lingered, wanting to ask the professor a question about the lecture. As they spoke, she felt a genuine connection, a shared passion for medicine that transcended the student-teacher dynamic. He encouraged her, his words bolstering her belief in her chosen path. As the months passed, Rachel's life began to find a new rhythm. The challenges of pregnancy while attending medical school were immense, but she managed with a quiet tenacity that earned her the respect of both peers and professors. When her son, whom she named Ruben, was born, it was as if a new chapter of her life was written in the very ink of joy and love. He was a beautiful, healthy boy with eyes wide and curious, always watching, always learning. Balancing motherhood and her demanding studies was no small feat, but Rachel found strength in her purpose. She knew that every late night, every hour spent studying while Ruben slept in his crib beside her, was a brick in the foundation of the life she was building for them both. Rachel's days were long and filled with countless responsibilities, but they were also interspersed with moments of profound joy and satisfaction. She was doing it, really doing it. She was becoming a doctor, not just for herself, but for her son, and for the young girl who had once watched her father's struggles and dreamed of a different life. As the first year of medical school drew to a close, Rachel stood outside the same lecture hall where she had attended her first class. She watched the sunset, its colors vibrant against the skyline. A sense of peace settled over her, a deep-seated knowledge that she had indeed turned her pain into something beautiful. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. Rachel stood in the bustling emergency room of the hospital, her white coat a badge of the journey she had endured to get here. The organized chaos of the ER was a far cry from the trailer park's claustrophobic disorder where she had grown up. She had always thought that saving lives would erase the memories of her father's destructive behavior and Chandler's deceit, but today would challenge that notion more than ever. The ambulance bay doors burst open, pulling Rachel's attention sharply to the present. Paramedics rushed in, wheeling a severely injured man on a stretcher. Blood stained his clothes and his face was pallid, his breathing shallow and labored. Multiple vehicle collision, head trauma, possible internal injuries. One of the paramedics shouted over the din as they navigated through the nurses and doctors. Rachel stepped forward, her role as lead attending physician snapping into focus. "Take him to Trauma Room 1, she commanded, her voice clear and authoritative. The team moved seamlessly, a well-oiled machine reacting to her every command. As the patient was transferred to the trauma table, Rachel washed her hands, her mind clinically detaching from any emotion, a necessary armor in her line of work. She approached the stretcher, her eyes scanning the man's injuries, preparing herself to make life-saving decisions. However, when she finally looked at his face, her heart skipped a beat. The world seemed to halt on its axis as recognition dawned. Chandler. His eyes were closed, his once charming features marred by abrasions and blood. Memories flooded back, the pain of his betrayal feeling as fresh as the day she discovered his duplicity. "Dr. Rachel," a nurse prompted, noticing her hesitation. Shaking off the shock, Rachel forced herself to focus. "Prepare for a CT scan, and I need his vitals monitored closely," she instructed, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. As they stabilized Chandler and prepared him for further imaging, Rachel stepped back, allowing her team to work while she collected her thoughts. How ironic that fate would bring Chandler, the architect of her greatest pain, under her care. It was a test of her professionalism and her personal growth. Hours later, after ensuring Chandler was stable and under the watchful eyes of the ICU team, Rachel finally allowed herself a moment to reflect. She walked to the small hospital garden, a place she often found solace during her breaks. Sitting on a secluded bench, the cool night air helped soothe her inner turmoil. "Dr. Rachel," a familiar voice called out. It was Thomas, a fellow doctor at the hospital and her supportive partner. He sat down beside her, his presence comforting. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," she said, managing a weak smile. Thomas looked at her with concern. "I heard about the patient, Chandler. How are you holding up?" Rachel sighed, the weight of her past and present colliding heavily within her. It's difficult, Thomas. I treated him, the man who almost broke me. I saved his life today." Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his. "And that shows how strong you are, Rachel. Not many could do what you did." She leaned against his shoulder, the warmth of his support a stark contrast to the cold isolation she had felt years ago. "Maybe, but it brought everything back, Thomas. The pain, the betrayal. But it also brought back how far you've come," he said gently. "You're not that same person anymore. You're a brilliant doctor, a wonderful mother, and my partner. You've built a new life." Rachel pondered his words, realizing the truth in them. Her journey had indeed come full circle. From the shattered dreams and heartbreak, she had risen, stronger and more resilient. Later, when Rachel returned to check on Chandler, he was awake, his expression one of confusion and pain. As their eyes met, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Rachel?" he whispered hoarsely. "Yes, Chandler, it's me," Rachel replied, her voice calm and professional despite the emotional undercurrents. "Why?" was all he could muster, a simple question loaded with years of unspoken accusations and regrets. Rachel took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Because it's my job to save lives, Chandler, even if one of those lives once tried to destroy mine." As Rachel prepared to leave Chandler's hospital room, his weak voice halted her steps. "Rachel, please," he implored, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. The room was dim, only the soft hum of medical equipment punctuating the heavy silence. Chandler struggled to sit up, wincing with pain as he did so, his face contorted not just by physical agony, but also by the weight of his remorse. "Can you ever forgive me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I've lost everything, Rachel. My life. It's been a lie, a series of manipulations and selfish choices. I have nothing left now, no one. I realize how much I hurt you, how deeply wrong I was." Rachel paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. The depth of Chandler's despair was evident, and part of her felt a stirring of pity for the broken man before her. Yet, the memories of his betrayal, the coldness in his eyes when he had told her to end her pregnancy, remained vivid and painful. "Chandler," Rachel began, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "I accept your apology, not because it changes anything, but because I refuse to carry the weight of your mistakes with me. I have moved on." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But forgiveness doesn't erase the consequences of your actions." Chandler's eyes glistened with tears, a mix of understanding and further regret washing over his face. "Do you? Do we have a—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the question, the hope of something left unbroken between them flickering briefly. Rachel knew what he was asking. In his eyes, there was a desperate need for connection, perhaps a hope that something of their past might have survived the wreckage. But Rachel had made a decision long ago, from the moment Chandler had discarded their future with his cruel words. "No, Chandler. There is nothing left for you here," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "You made your choice back then, and I made mine. You asked me to erase a life, our child's life, and at that moment, you ceased to be anything to me but a memory." Chandler's face fell, the finality of her words sinking in. He lay back down, defeated, the lines of his face softened by sadness and a profound loss. Rachel turned away, her heart heavy, but her conscience clear. She had come to terms with the past, and she had built a life of integrity and love, one that Chandler had no part in. As she walked back through the hospital's quiet corridors, she thought of her son, the light of her life, who had never known the man in that hospital bed and never would. She had protected her child from the pain and chaos that Chandler had brought into her life, and in doing so, she had given him the best life possible. Leaving the hospital that night, Rachel felt a chapter close behind her, one filled with pain, but also with immense growth and strength. She had faced her past, offered forgiveness, and reclaimed her life, affirming that some bonds, once broken, were meant to remain so, allowing new, healthier connections to flourish. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows and bathing Rachel's new home in a warm, golden light. She stood in the kitchen, watching through the window as Thomas played with their children in the backyard. The laughter and shouts of joy that floated in through the open window filled her with a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. "Mommy, look!" shouted Lucia, her youngest, waving from the swing that Thomas had installed last summer. Rachel smiled and waved back, her heart swelling with love for the little family they had created together. Turning back to the stove, Rachel stirred the pot of stew she was preparing for dinner. The aroma filled the kitchen, a blend of spices and warmth that made the house feel even more like a home. Thomas came in, wiping his hands on a towel. He wrapped his arms around Rachel from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "How was your day at the clinic?" he asked, kissing her cheek softly. "It was good, busy as always," Rachel replied, leaning back into his embrace. "And yours?" "Productive. The new research project is coming along well," Thomas said, his voice tinged with excitement. He was a pediatrician, and his passion for his work was one of the many things that had drawn Rachel to him. That night, after putting the children to bed and saying goodnight to Thomas, Rachel stepped out onto their small porch. She looked up at the stars, thinking about her journey from a frightened girl in a troubled home to a confident woman surrounded by love. She whispered a quiet thank you to the stars, to the universe for guiding her through the darkness, and to herself for never giving up. With a deep, contented sigh, Rachel turned back inside, ready to face whatever new challenges and joys tomorrow might bring. Her past was a tapestry of both dark and light threads, each one essential in crafting the vibrant, hopeful horizon that now stretched out before her. As they talked, Rachel thought about how different her life was now from the days she had spent in the shadow of her past. She had built a career, a family, and a life filled with love and respect, things she had once thought might forever elude her because of the scars left by Chandler's betrayal and the turmoil of her early family life. Later that evening, after dinner, the family settled into the living room. Rachel and Thomas sat on the couch, watching Ruben and Lucia play a board game on the floor. Rachel's thoughts drifted back to Chandler, to the closure she had finally found. She remembered looking into Chandler's eyes in the hospital, seeing the man who had once shattered her world, now broken himself. She had walked away knowing that she had truly moved on, that she was no longer bound by the hurt he had caused. "Thinking about the past?" Thomas asked, noticing her distant gaze. "A little," Rachel admitted. "Seeing Chandler again brought up a lot of memories, but it also reminded me of how far I've come." Thomas squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You're incredibly strong, Rachel. You turned your pain into power, into something beautiful." Rachel smiled, squeezing his hand back. "I couldn't have done it without you and the kids. You gave me the strength to heal." As they sat there, the room filled with the sound of their children's laughter, Rachel felt a surge of gratitude for her present life and for the trials that had refined her. She realized that each step of her journey, even the most painful ones, had been necessary to bring her to this place of contentment and fulfillment.